In this video, I'm looking at another new addition to UVLayout for 2025-02. So this is some new options for snap and pivot. So I'll explain what those mean. Alright, so this is a pretty simple one. So normally when you're moving things around, you can just move them in any direction. Previously under the snap panel here, we can turn a grid on so things snap to a grid, or let's say we just want to move it along horizontal lines there, it's snapping to the grid there. So it was possible to constrain moves to U and V, but you sort of had to open up the snap panel here and get things just right to get it working in a sort of easy way. So what's new is now you can just use Control U and Control V. So here I'll do Control U, and you see it says move in U only. So now I can just move things, sort of constrain them to the U direction. If I do Control U, that turns it off. Control V moves things vertically in the V direction. If I do Control U, then switches to U direction. So it's Control U and V is just to toggle on and off for constrained moves in the U and V direction. That works for moving shells, it works for moving points, works for those sorts of things. Alright, so let's turn that off. The other one is let's just move a couple of these things closer together. So under snap here, we've got snap to points. You turn that on there so that then when I move a point here, it will snap to, oops, I've got to turn that off. Here it's going to snap to those vertices. So that's always been there. You can see the blue circle there indicates the snap distance. Here, this is new where I can change that amount. So the circle there's got bigger. So that's always pretty much been there. It only snaps to vertices. What's new is you can now tick edges here. So it will snap along an edge or to a point. So here you can see if I'm moving that vertex along the edge, it's snapping to the edge, yes, but then if it approaches the vertex, it'll snap to that vertex. So here if I turn off snap to points, it's only going to snap to the edges. It doesn't also snap to the vertex as soon as it gets close to it. Alright, so that's new. So that's the new snap options. There's one more I forgot to mention. I'm rotating that shell. It can freely move any angle, or if under the snap panel here, I can set the snap rotation, say, to 30 degrees. So then it only rotates in 30-degree increments. All right, so that's and that's only active when the snap panel is open. So if I hide the snap panel, it disables that snapping. All right, so that's snapping. Now the new options for pivot. So by that I mean when you're rotating a shell, or here I'm rotating a group of shells. Also it affects when you manually rotate things here on the panel, set a specific number of degrees. The pivot by default is at the center of that selection. So here I've selected 3 shells, and the pivot, you can just see it there. The red cross indicates the center of that selection. So that's the default pivot. So there's a couple of options there to change that, but you have to open up here under the Move Scale Rotate panel, click on Shell, or points, and it opens up these additional couple of options. So the pinned one's most obvious. If I select pinned, it's not going to do anything unless you have a pinned point somewhere. So let's say, for example, I wanted to rotate this group of shells but around this point here. So let's go P. So I've pinned that point with the P key, and then now it will rotate around that pinned point. If I turn pinned off, then again it will just fall back to rotating around the center. Alright, so that's, you can set, what I'll do is I can set another pinpoint and demonstrate that. So what it does, it's the average of the pinned points. So let's say if you didn't want it just on a particular point but halfway along an edge or something, you'd pin both ends, and then that's the pivot point, is the average of those two pinned points. Okay, so that's the pinned option. The other option is mouse. Okay, sorry, I should have mentioned that also affects scaling, so it'll scale around that pivot point as well as rotate around that pivot point. Alright, so the other option is mouse. So what that does is, and I'll disable pinned here because we don't want that. So as I said, by default, the pivot is the midpoint of the selection. When you have mouse enabled, the pivot is where the mouse starts off at. So I'll demonstrate that. Let's say you wanted to rotate this group around here, but you don't want to go to the trouble of pinning a point. Then with mouse selected, it sets the pivot where you first click, and then you sort of have to drag the pointer off to one side to start the rotation, because the pointer's at the pivot point already. You have to drag it off. So there's that. If I wanted to pivot it around here, then I can do that. If I want to pivot around there, I do that. So it just allows you to, without having to pin points or just accept the center point, you can just have mouse enabled, and wherever the mouse is, it's even, I could, particularly with, we've got a grouped shells here, I can have the pivot out in space somewhere, so it doesn't need to, there's no geometry there where I could pin a point, but I can still set that up as the pivot point quickly with that mouse option enabled. Alright, so that's the pivot options. So under the Move, Scale, Rotate panel, mouse or pinned. And I'll explain this PTS is new, so you'll see that in another video that's going to demonstrate the 2025-02 changes. But actually I forgot to mention one thing that's changed, and that applies to this pivot thing again. So let's just turn those off, and I'll just accept the pivot as the center point. So in previous versions, again, yeah, the pivot was in the center, but the way it mapped the mouse pointer to what angle was rotated was a bit, I don't know, ambiguous. So that sometimes you would rotate, you'd move the pointer up and the shell would rotate down, or it was just, you'd have to move the pointer to work out which way it was going and then go in reverse if it was going the wrong way. So I fixed that. So this is something, now let's say, so we got the pivot there, the center, the mouse starts here. So the angle is a direct correlation between where the pointer is on the geometry versus the pivot. So, as I'm moving the pointer around, you can see the pointer is basically fixed, is a fixed location on the geometry there. So it's a direct connection between where the pointer is and the pivot. That controls the rotation. So another side effect of that is so here I'm rotating, if you want finer control over the angle, then just move the pointer further away. So here I've got the pointer way out to the right, and so then I can have much more finer control over the actual amount of rotation. Or if you move it closer, you get a lot more rotation. If you move too close to the pivot, it turns off the rotation, because obviously it would just be spinning all over the place like that. So that's why it's fading out there. So just keep mindful that now the pointer has to be away from the pivot to get some sort of rotation, but it gives you a lot more sort of finer control, more obvious control over the angle. All right, so that's new in UVLayout 2025-02.